December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, the United States Capitol building stands against a gray winter sky, and inside its chambers, history is about to be made, not the history you learned in school, not the unanimous declaration of war that President Roosevelt would call for. No, this is the story of a single voice of dissent in a moment when dissent seemed impossible. 470 members of Congress will vote today, 470 voices representing millions of Americans, all reeling from the shock of yesterday's attack. Japanese bombs have killed more than 2,000 Americans. The Pacific Fleet lies in ruins at Pearl Harbor. The nation demands vengeance. The president has called it a date which will live in infamy, and in this chamber, among those 470 representatives, one person will stand alone, one person will say no, one person will cast the only vote against entering World War II. Her name was Jeannette Rankin, and here's the thing that makes this story even more remarkable, even more impossible. This wasn't her first time. 24 years earlier, in 1917, she had cast one of 50 votes against entering World War I. He was the only member of Congress to vote against both world wars. How does one person find the courage to stand completely alone? What kind of conviction does it take to face down an entire nation baying for war? And perhaps most importantly, was she right? This is not a simple story of heroism or villainy. This is a story about conscience, about the terrifying weight of democratic responsibility, and about what it costs to be the only person in the room willing to say no. The weight of one vote. We live in an age of performative politics, where controversy is currency and every vote is calculated for maximum political advantage. Congressional dissent today is often theater, carefully staged, focus grouped, and designed to play well on cable news and social media. But imagine for a moment a different kind of dissent. Imagine knowing, with absolute certainty, that your vote will change nothing, that the war will happen with or without your approval, that your no is purely symbolic, and yet imagine knowing that this symbolic gesture will destroy your political career, make you a pariah in your own party, subject you to death threats, and cement your name in history as either a coward or a fool. Now imagine doing it anyway, not once but twice. That's the story of Jeannette Rankin, and to understand why she did what she did, we need to go back, not just to 1941, and not just to 1917, but all the way back to a ranch in Montana Territory, where a girl born in 1880 would grow up to become the most consequential vote against war in American history. Why this story matters. Before we dive into the full scope of Rankin's life, we need to understand why her story has been largely forgotten, and why it desperately needs to be remembered. First, there's the gender factor. Jeannette Rankin was the first woman ever elected to the United States Congress. She achieved this in 1916, 4 years before women won the right to vote nationally. Think about that for a moment. She was elected to make laws for people who in most states couldn't even vote. Her achievement was so unprecedented, so shocking to the political establishment, that many didn't know how to process it. And when she voted against World War I, the criticism came wrapped in the language of gender. She wasn't just wrong, she was proving that women were too emotional, too weak, too pacifistic to handle the serious business of governance. Her vote was used as ammunition against the entire women's suffrage movement. The suffragists themselves turned on her. The women who had fought alongside her, who had marched and protested and risked arrest for the right to participate in democracy, many of them publicly denounced her vote. They wanted to prove women could be just as hawkish, just as tough as men. Rankin's principled pacifism was an inconvenience to their cause. So the first reason her story matters is this: it reveals the impossible double bind women faced in early American politics: conform to masculine norms of aggression and military support, or be dismissed as hysterical and unfit for office. Rankin chose a third path: unwavering adherence to her own moral compass and the consequences. Second, there's the question of the wars themselves. We tend to think of World War I and World War II as a package deal, two chapters in the same story. The good wars, the necessary wars. World War I made the world safe for democracy, we're told. World War II defeated fascism. But the reality is far more complex. World War I was a catastrophic bloodbath that killed 17 million people, redrew the map of Europe in ways that directly led to World War II, and accomplished almost nothing of lasting value. Many historians now view it as a pointless slaughter driven by imperial ambitions, arms manufacturers, and nationalist fervor. World War II, on the other hand, is genuinely viewed by most historians as a necessary war to stop genocidal fascism. Even many pacifists supported it. Rankin voted against both, and this puts us in an interesting position as we examine her story. Was she right about World War I? Almost certainly yes in hindsight. Was she right about World War II? That's a much harder question, and it's precisely this complexity that makes her story so compelling. He wasn't making calculated political decisions. He wasn't reading polls or checking with advisors. He was voting her conscience, based on a deeply held belief that war itself, all war, was an unacceptable way to resolve human conflicts. He believed this even when bombers were destroying Pearl Harbor, even when Nazi Germany was conquering Europe, even when the entire nation stood against her. The third reason this story matters is what it tells us about dissent in democracy. Since World War II, the United States has been involved in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, twice Afghanistan, and countless smaller military operations. Congressional opposition has varied, but never has a single person stood completely alone against a declaration of war. What happened to Jeannette Rankin after her vote? The vitriol, the threats, the political exile created a chilling effect that persists to this day. Her story is a warning about the cost of principled dissent in times of national crisis. It's also an inspiration for anyone who has ever felt the pressure to stay silent when conscience demands speech. In the post-9/11 era, when the authorization for use of military force passed with only one dissenting vote in the entire Congress, California, Representative Barbara Lee, who explicitly invoked Rankin's legacy, we need to understand what that kind of courage looks like, and what it cost. The structure of this story. Here's how we're going to tell the story. We'll begin in Montana Territory in the late 19th century, where a young Jeannette Rankin is forming the convictions that will define her life. We'll follow her through the suffrage movement, her groundbreaking election to Congress, and that first devastating vote against World War I. Then we'll track her through the wilderness years, the 2 decades between her congressional terms, when she worked tirelessly for peace even as the world lurched toward another global conflict. We'll experience with her the agony of watching Europe descend into war again, the impossible decision to return to Congress in 1940, and then that moment on December 8, 1941, when she once again stood alone. Finally, we'll examine her legacy, how she was viewed in her own time versus how history has judged her, and what her story means for democracy, for women in politics, and for the ongoing debate about war and peace in American life. This is not a hagiography. Rankin was complex, sometimes difficult, occasionally contradictory. He made choices that even her allies questioned, but she was also undeniably brave, principled to a fault, and willing to sacrifice everything for what she believed was right. So let's return to that House chamber on December 8, 1941. The roll is about to be called. 470 members will vote. 469 will say yes to war. And one woman from Montana sitting in her seat, knowing exactly what's about to happen, will say no. But to understand that moment, we first need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who Jeannette Rankin was, where she came from, and how a ranch girl from Montana became the most principled voice against war that Congress has ever known. Montana Territory, the making of a rebel. June 11th, 1880, Jeannette Pickering Rankin enters the world on a ranch near Missoula, in what is still Montana Territory. Montana won't achieve statehood for another 9 years. This is the frontier, not the romanticized frontier of dime novels, but the real thing. Harsh winters, economic uncertainty, and a social order still being written. Her father, John Rankin, is a rancher and a carpenter, a self-made man who built his own house and his own business. Her mother, Olive Pickering Rankin, is a schoolteacher from New Hampshire who came west for adventure and found it. Together, they represent a peculiar Montana combination, rugged individualism tempered by Eastern education and progressive values. Jeannette is the oldest of 7 children, 6 girls and 1 boy, Wellington, who will later become one of the wealthiest men in Montana through ranching and real estate. From the beginning, the Rankin household operates on principles that are unusual for the time. John Rankin, despite his frontier masculinity, believes his daughter should be educated just as thoroughly as his son. Olive insists that all the children learn to think independently, to question authority, and to develop their own moral compasses. This is crucial to understanding Jeannette. He doesn't grow up in a household where women are expected to be decorative and silent. He grows up working real work, ranch work. He learns to ride horses, to repair fences, to do whatever needs doing. There's no room for helpless femininity on a Montana ranch, but there's also an intellectual rigor in the household. Olive reads to the children constantly. The Rankin home has bookshelves of them, a fortune in books for a frontier family. History, philosophy, literature. Jeannette grows up reading about the great debates of human civilization. He learns early that the world is bigger than Montana, that ideas matter, and that individuals can change the course of history. When Jeannette is 18, her father dies. She's the oldest child, and suddenly she's helping her mother manage a household, care for younger siblings, and figure out how to maintain the family's economic stability. 1898, the Spanish-American War is happening, but it's distant, abstract. In Montana, the concerns are more immediate: crops, livestock, money, education, and awakening. In 1898, Jeannette enrolls at the University of Montana in Missoula. It's a small school. Montana itself only has about 243,000 people. He studies biology, planning to become a teacher. It's one of the few professional paths open to women, and it seems like a practical choice. But something happens during her college years. He begins to notice the contradictions in American democracy. She's being educated, she's reading about the founding principles of the United States, about equality and representative government, and yet, she can't vote. Neither can her mother, her sisters, or any other woman. Half the population is excluded from the most basic right of citizenship. This isn't abstract philosophy anymore. It's personal. He graduates in 1902 with a degree in biology. She's 22 years old, and she does exactly what society expects. She becomes a teacher. For several years, she teaches in rural Montana schools. It's honest work, important work, but it's not enough. In 1908, at age 28, Rankin makes a decision that will change her life. He leaves Montana and moves to San Francisco to attend the University of California to study social work. Is this significant? Social work is a new field, merging from the progressive era's commitment to addressing urban poverty, labor exploitation, and the failures of industrial capitalism. In San Francisco and later in Seattle, where she works in settlement houses, Rankin sees poverty up close, not the hardscrabble poverty of rural Montana, where families might struggle but had land and dignity. This is urban poverty: tenements, worshops, children working in factories, families crushed by systems they can't control. And here's what radicalizes her. She realizes that these problems are political. They can't be solved by charity alone, or by well-meaning social workers. They require changes in law. They require political power, and women have none. He sees mothers struggling to feed their children on wages determined by men. He sees working conditions that kill and maim, regulated by laws written by men. He sees a political system that claims to be democratic, but excludes half the population from participation. The suffrage awakening. In 1910, Jeannette Rankin attends a suffrage meeting in Seattle. It's not her first exposure to the movement. Women have been fighting for the vote since before the Civil War, but something crystallizes for her in that moment. This isn't just about abstract rights. This is about power. If women can't vote, they can't change the laws that govern their lives. They can't protect their children from exploitative labor. They can't demand safe workplaces. They can't end the wars that kill their sons. Pacifism isn't yet her primary focus. That will come later, but she's beginning to connect the dots. Political powerlessness means vulnerability to the decisions of others, and those decisions, made by men in smoke-filled rooms, often involve violence. He throws herself into the suffrage movement, first in Washington state, which grants women the vote in 1910, and then in California, which does the same in 1911. She's not just a supporter, she becomes an organizer, a strategist. She's brilliant at it. She understands how to build coalitions, how to counter opposition arguments, how to frame suffrage not as a threat to traditional values but as a fulfillment of American democratic principles. By 1912, she's moved to New New York City, working for the National American Woman Suffrage Association. She's becoming known in the movement as a tireless worker, an effective speaker, and a strategic thinker. She's also developing her own political philosophy, one that will define her career. He believes in nonviolence, not just as a tactic, but as a principle. She's influenced by Leo Tolstoy's Christian anarchism, by the labor movement's debates about strikes versus sabotage, by the growing international peace movement. She's beginning to see connections between militarism abroad and oppression at home. Nations that glorify war, she believes, inevitably create societies built on hierarchy and violence. This is unusual thinking for the time. The suffrage movement is actually split on questions of war and peace. Some suffragists argue that women will make the nation more peaceful, that women's moral superiority will lead to a less militaristic foreign policy. Others insist that women can be just as patriotic and supportive of military action as men, and that suffrage should not be tied to pacifism. Rankin is in the first camp, but she's strategic enough not to make it her central message. Not yet. Returning to Montana, the plan takes shape. In 1913, Jeannette Rankin returns to Montana. She's been away for 5 years, working in the national suffrage movement, but now she's coming home with a mission. Montana doesn't have women's suffrage yet, and she's going to change that. Montana in 1913 is changing rapidly. The population has more than doubled since Jeannette was a child. The copper mining industry dominates the state's economy and its politics. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company essentially owns the state government. It's an oligarchy dressed up as democracy, but there's also a strong progressive tradition in Montana. The Socialist Party has significant support, labor unions are powerful, and there's a frontier tradition of women's participation in public life that makes Montana more receptive to suffrage than many eastern states. Rankin crisscrosses the state, organizing, speaking, lobbying. She's 33 years old, unmarried, a spinster by the standards of her time, though she's chosen this. She's had proposals, but she's seen how marriage limits women's options, legally and practically. She's chosen a different path. She's also, it should be noted, financially independent. Her brother Wellington's business success means the Rankin family has money. Jeannette doesn't need to marry for economic security. This privilege enables her activism. She can afford to spend her time organizing rather than working for wages. It's worth acknowledging this advantage, even as we recognize her courage. The suffrage campaign in Montana is intense. The opposition comes from predictable sources: conservative churches, the liquor industry, which fears that women voters will support prohibition, and political machines that benefit from the status quo. But there's also opposition from women themselves, women who have internalized the idea that their proper sphere is the home, that politics is masculine and corrupting. Rankin's strategy is brilliant. He doesn't argue that women are morally superior to men. She argues that democracy requires the participation of all citizens. He connects suffrage to practical issues: education, labor conditions, child welfare. He builds a coalition that crosses class and ethnic lines, not easy in a state divided between copper barons and workers, ranchers and miners, native-born and immigrants. November 3, 1914. Montana voters approve women's suffrage by a margin of 52 to 48%. It's a narrow victory, but it's a victory. Montana becomes one of 11 states where women can vote in all elections. And for Jeannette Rankin, it's not an end, it's a beginning. She spent years fighting for the right to vote. Now, she's going to do something unprecedented. She's going to run for Congress. The seeds of pacifism. We need to pause here and understand the world situation in 1915, because it's crucial to what comes next. In August 1914, Europe explodes into war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo sets off a chain reaction of alliances and mobilizations. Within weeks, the major powers of Europe are locked in what will become the most devastating war in human history to that point. The United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, declares neutrality. Wilson runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Americans watch the carnage in Europe with horror: the trenches, the machine guns, the poison gas, the millions of dead, and most want no part of it. But there are powerful forces pushing for American entry into the war. Banks have loaned billions to Britain and France. Arms manufacturers are making fortunes supplying the Allies. And there's a strain of American thought that sees the war as a chance to prove American greatness, to take a place at the table of great powers. Jeannette Rankin is watching all of this carefully. She's involved in the peace movement, which is growing rapidly. Organizations like the Women's Peace Party, founded by Jane Addams in 1915, argue that women must use their newly won political power to oppose war. They see a connection between the suffrage fight and the peace fight. Both are about challenging systems of violence and domination. Rankin is evolving. Her pacifism is becoming more than just a preference for negotiation over conflict. It's becoming a fundamental moral position. She's reading the casualty reports from Europe, seeing the photographs of devastated landscapes and shattered bodies, and she's making a decision. If she ever has political power, she will use it to oppose war. This decision is forming even before she runs for Congress. She's not naive about the consequences. He knows that opposing war, especially if the United States enters the European conflict, will be politically disastrous. But she's watched women fight for decades for the right to participate in democracy. If that participation means simply rubber stamping the decisions of male politicians, what's the point? He believes she has to believe that women in politics can make a difference, that they can bring a different perspective, not because women are inherently more peaceful. She's too sophisticated to believe that, but because women have been excluded from the systems of power that glorify militarism. They have a chance to challenge those systems. Family dynamics and support. Before we move to her congressional campaign, we need to understand the family dynamics that enable Rankin's career. Her brother Wellington is crucial to her story. He's built a real estate and ranching empire and become wealthy. He's also progressive in his politics and deeply supportive of his older sister. Wellington provides financial backing for Jeanette's campaigns. He provides emotional support. He never questions her right to pursue a political political career, never suggests she should marry and settle down. In a time when most women need their husband's permission to work outside the home, Jeannette has a brother who actively facilitates her independence. Her sisters too are supportive: Edna, Grace, Mary, Harriet, and Philna. They all believe in what Jeannette is doing. The Rankin women form a kind of mutual support network, defying the stereotype of women as competitive and petty with each other. But there's also complexity here. Jeannette is the trailblazer, the one who gets the attention and the acclaim. The others have to live somewhat in her shadow, and Jeannette herself is intensely focused, sometimes to the point of single-mindedness. She's demanding, certain of her principles, and patient with compromise. These traits will serve her well in politics, where conviction matters, but they'll also make her isolated, especially after her votes against war make her radioactive in Washington. The decision to run. Late 1915, Jeannette Rankin makes her decision. He will run for one of Montana's two at-large congressional seats in the 1916 election. Montana, because of its small population, doesn't have distinct congressional districts. Instead, voters choose two representatives who both represent the entire state. This system, oddly enough, works to Rankin's advantage. He doesn't need to win a majority in a single district. She just needs to be one of the top two vote-getters statewide. The decision is audacious. No woman has ever served in Congress. Not one in the 127 years since the Constitution was ratified. The very idea seems absurd to many. Congress is an all-male club, steeped in masculine rituals and traditions. The idea of a woman in that chamber strikes many as unnatural, even dangerous. But Rankin sees an opportunity. Montana is progressive. Women can vote, and she's well known from the suffrage campaign. If it can happen anywhere, it can happen in Montana. He has convictions she wants to advance: suffrage nationally, labor protections, child welfare, and though she doesn't emphasize this too heavily, yet peace. But mostly she wants to prove that women can do this, that they can run, win, and govern effectively, that democracy is incomplete without their participation. As 1916 begins, Jeannette Rankin starts building her campaign. He knows it will be the fight of her life. He has no idea that winning will only be the beginning of the struggle. The 1916 campaign begins. January 1916. Jeannette Rankin announces her candidacy for the United States House of Representatives. The reaction is swift and predictable. Newspapers mock the idea. Political insiders dismiss it as a publicity stunt. The Anaconda Copper Mining Company, which controls most of Montana's newspapers through advertising revenue, is quietly hostile. A woman in Congress threatens the cozy relationship between industry and government. But Rankin has learned from the suffrage campaign. He knows how to organize. He knows how to reach voters who feel excluded from the political process. And she has something her opponents lack: a story that captures people's imagination. She's a Montana native, a rancher's daughter who understands rural life. She's educated and sophisticated, having worked in major cities. She's accomplished. She led the successful suffrage campaign, and she's representing something larger than herself: the idea that democracy should include everyone, not just men of property and power. Her campaign platform is progressive but not radical by Montana standards. He supports an 8-hour workday, protection for child laborers, prohibition of alcohol, popular in Montana at the time, and national women's suffrage. She also supports preparedness, strengthening America's military in case of war, but emphasizes that the goal should be to avoid conflict. This is strategic. She's personally opposed to war, but she knows that appearing too pacifistic will doom her campaign. Europe is tearing itself apart. Americans are afraid. They want strength, or at least the appearance of it. So Rankin threads a needle. She supports national defense while advocating for peace and diplomacy. Worth noting the contradiction here, one that will haunt her later. She's softening her pacifism for political expediency. It's understandable she can't advance any of her principles if she doesn't win, but it means that some voters who support her don't fully understand her deepest convictions. The campaign is grueling. Montana is a huge state with terrible roads and limited transportation. Rankin travels by train, by car when possible, sometimes by horse and wagon. He speaks in mining towns and farming communities, in union halls and church basements. He shakes thousands of hands. He listens to people's concerns and connects them to her platform. Opposition and obstacles. The opposition to Rankin's campaign comes from multiple directions, and it's often viciously sexist. Editorial cartoons depict her as a school marm trying to tell men what to do. Opponents claim that women are too emotional for politics, that they'll turn Congress into a sewing circle, that Rankin's election will undermine the family structure. There's also resistance from within the political establishment of her own Republican Party. Montana politics in 1916 are dominated by the copper mining interests, and they prefer candidates they can control. Rankin is too independent, too principled, too unpredictable, but she has advantages. The progressive movement is strong in Montana. The Socialist Party, which supports women's suffrage and workers' rights, doesn't run a candidate against her, passively supporting her campaign. Labor unions, grateful for her support of the 8-hour day and child labor laws, mobilize their members. And then there are the women voters. Montana women have had the vote for less than 2 years, and many are eager to prove their political competence. Voting for Rankin becomes a statement. Women aren't just participating in democracy, they're transforming it. Rankin's campaign is remarkably modern in its tactics. He builds a network of local organizers, mostly women, who work in their communities. He uses targeted messaging, labor themes in mining towns, agricultural issues in farming areas, social reform in cities. He raises money from small donors across the state, refusing to take large contributions from corporate interests. She's also media savvy by 1916 standards. He writes letters to newspaper editors, submits op-eds, and gives interviews. When newspapers refuse to cover her fairly, he works around them, distributing printed materials and speaking directly to voters. One of her most effective strategies is to frame her campaign not just as a bid for office, but as a continuation of the suffrage movement. Women fought for the vote, she argues, not just to cast ballots but to participate fully in governance. Electing her proves that the suffrage victory meant something, that women's political participation isn't just symbolic. The national stage. As the 1916 campaign progresses, something interesting happens. Rankin's candidacy gains national attention. Suffrage organizations across the country start watching Montana. If Rankin wins, she'll be the first congresswoman in American history. She'll prove that women can compete and win in the masculine world of politics. National suffrage leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul take notice. They see Rankin's campaign as a test case. If she wins, it will energize the national suffrage movement, which is pushing for a constitutional amendment to guarantee women's voting rights nationwide. If she loses, especially after running a strong campaign, it will be used as evidence that Americans aren't ready for women in high office. This puts enormous pressure on Rankin. She's not just running for herself or even for Montana. She's running for women everywhere. Every speech, every appearance, every policy position is scrutinized. He has to be perfect or close to it because any mistake will be attributed not just to her as an individual, but to her entire gender. The 1916 election is also a presidential year. Woodrow Wilson is running for re-election on that He Kept Us Out of War platform. Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican candidate, is also generally supportive of neutrality, though he's more hawkish than Wilson. The question of American involvement in the European war looms over every race. Rankin, running as a Republican, has to navigate this carefully. He can't be seen as too dovish that's politically suicidal, but she also can't abandon her principles. She emphasizes that the best way to support America is to keep it out of European conflicts, to focus on domestic reform, to use diplomacy rather than force. It's a message that resonates at least in Montana. People are tired of watching young men die in European trenches. They want someone who will fight for peace. Election night, November 7, 1916. November 7th, 1916. Montana voters go to the polls. The presidential race is too close to call. Wilson versus Hughes will remain uncertain for days. But in Montana, the congressional races are clearer. Remember, Montana voters are choosing two representatives. The top two vote-getters win. One of the favorites is John Evans, a Democrat who served in Congress before. The question is who will come in second. As returns come in throughout the night, a picture emerges. Jeannette Rankin is running strong. She's not winning in a landslide. This is too historic and too controversial for that, but she's competitive. In mining towns, labor precincts are turning out for her. In rural areas, farmers and ranchers who remember her father are supporting her, and women voters, new women voters, excited to make their voices heard, are backing her in strong numbers. By the early morning of November 8th, it's clear Jeannette Rankin has won. She's the second highest vote getter in Montana, behind Democrat John Evans. He will be the first woman elected to the United States Congress. The victory margin is relatively comfortable. She receives about 40,000 votes in a state where total turnout is around 180,000. But it's the achievement, not the margin, that matters. 127 years after the first Congress convened, a woman will finally take a seat in the chamber. The reaction is immediate and national. Newspapers across the country run the story on their front pages. Some are celebratory, seeing it as progress. Others are skeptical or mocking. The New York Times runs a condescending headline about the lady congressman. Editorial cartoons depict Rankin in exaggerated feminine terms: big hats, flowing dresses, melting salts. But in Montana, and in suffrage organizations nationwide, there's jubilation. Women have proven they can not only vote, but win. Rankin's election is a breakthrough moment. It suggests that the barriers to women's full political participation are crumbling. Rankin herself is characteristically focused. He gives a brief victory speech thanking her supporters, but she's already thinking ahead. He knows the real test is just beginning. Winning the election was one thing. Serving effectively, proving that a woman can handle the job, advancing her policy priorities, that's something else entirely. And there's another factor, one that's growing more ominous by the day. The war in Europe is intensifying. American involvement, which seemed distant during the campaign, is becoming more likely. President Wilson, who ran on keeping America out of war, is facing increasing pressure to join the Allies. If America goes to war, Congress will have to vote on it, and Jeannette Rankin will have to decide where she stands. The transition, preparing for Washington. The months between the election in November 1916 and the start of the new Congress in April 1917 are a strange interlude. Rankin is congressman-elect, but she's not yet in office. He uses the time to prepare, to study the issues she'll be dealing with, to build relationships with other members of the Montana delegation. But the world situation is deteriorating rapidly. In January 1917, Germany announces it will resume unrestricted submarine warfare, attacking any ship, including American vessels, that enters the war zone around Britain. In February, the British intercept and decode the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposes an alliance with Mexico against the United States. American public opinion, which has been largely isolationist, begins to shift. The sinking of American ships, the German proposal to Mexico, the continuing Allied propaganda about German atrocities, all of it creates momentum toward war. Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated for his second term on March 5, 1917. In his inaugural address, he speaks ominously about the challenges ahead, about America's responsibilities to the world. The man who ran on keeping America out of war is clearly preparing the nation for the opposite. Rankin, watching from Montana, feels the ground shifting beneath her. He knows what's coming. She spent the months since her election thinking about how she'll handle it. She's read everything she can about the war, about international law, about the history of American foreign policy, and she's reached a conclusion. If there's a vote on war, she will vote no. It's not a decision she reaches lightly. She understands the political cost. He knows it could end her career before it truly begins, but she believes deeply and fundamentally that the war is wrong, that American entry will accomplish nothing except adding American bodies to the piles of European dead, that the war is being driven by profiteers and imperialists, not by any genuine threat to American security. She also believes that women in politics must offer an alternative to masculine militarism. If she simply votes with the majority, if she supports war just to prove women can be tough, then what's the point of having women in Congress? Rival in Washington, April 1917. Early April 1917. Jeannette Rankin boards a train in Montana bound for Washington. The journey takes several days, crossing the vast American interior. He travels with her sister Edna, who will serve as her secretary and companion in Washington. When she arrives at Union Station on April 2nd, she's met by reporters. Lots of reporters. She's a curiosity, a novelty. The first woman congressman. They ask about her clothes, her marital status, whether she'll cry during debates. The sexism is blatant, but Rankin handles it with grace. He's been dealing with this kind of condescension throughout the campaign. That same day, April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson addresses a special joint session of Congress. Rankin, not yet sworn in, watches from the gallery. Wilson delivers one of the most famous speeches in American history, asking Congress to declare war on Germany.